Hey, are you watching this video without being subscribed?
Like, because growing up in the church, they always talked about how persecuted the Mormons were. And then watching this, I was like, well, was that warranted then? Like,
Imagine if there was a movie about the Salem witch trials that gave the impression that Christians in general are a danger to women.
Now imagine if Jacob Hansen was honest about the Mormon Reformation and the violent rhetoric, the blood atonement, the oath of vengeance that was in the temple endowment for 80 years, the extermination order for the Timpanogos Utes by Brigham Young, if he could be honest about that when he talks about Governor Boggs. But nope, this is what we get.
Rose, because she was like, certain people just shouldn't mix. And I was like, Mom, that's racist. And she said, no, not racist. It's the teaching of the church, and here's why.
Earlier, when Brigham Young heard that a black Mormon in Massachusetts had married a white woman, he told the quorum of the 12 apostles that he would have them killed if they were far away from the Gentiles. So on December 11th, Coleman was discovered by friends of the woman. The group of vigilantes hit Coleman with a large rock. Using his own Bowie knife, his attackers slit his throat so deeply from ear to ear that he was nearly decapitated, as well as slicing open his right breast in what some believe was a mimicry of the penalties which are illustrated in the temple ritual. Not all of Coleman's wounds correlated with the temple ritual, however, since he was also castrated. A pre-penciled placard which read, "Notice to all N-words. Take warning, leave white women alone," was then pinned to his corpse.
That was like the second story that I heard that solidified me leaving church.
The actual violence, the actual history was far worse than what's depicted. So there's a lot, both massacres, most of the victims were children.
Oh, yeah. And so, Brigham Young signing that extermination order of any Utes that will not leave willingly in 1850 kind of gives you a playbook of what he's capable of anyway.
Hey, if you're new here, feel free to watch our last video. Hopefully I'll put it here, possibly, please. Basically, we're just a group of ex-Mormon goobers that use VR as a way of connecting anonymously and over long distance for discussions, activities, and basically just taking online community to the next level. It's free and accessible for anyone interested, even if you don't have a VR headset. So, okay, a while back, before RFM highlighted our channel and that Gin Camp call, thanks by the way, RFM and all you new subscribers. You know what? Gotta show it. Oh yeah, there we go. That's what I'm talking about. Yeah. Thanks guys. A few of us got together outside of the regular XHEs we do to watch Jacob Hansen's horrendous American Primeval response. He uses outdated historical narratives that demonstrably were created to mislead the public and the government of the time and justify the cold-blooded murder of about 120 migrants that were passing through Utah in what's known as the Meadows Massacre. This is the darkest stain on Mormon history, and the irony here is that Jacob Hansen is criticizing the show for not being historically accurate, which it never claims to be, while he makes historical errors in the name of correcting them. And on top of that, the reality is that the show portrayed the Mountain Meadows Massacre as much less gruesome, deceitful, and disturbing than it really was. Mormon apologetics. Are you okay? Check that out, by the way. Whoa. Yeah, this place is sick. Real quick, before we get started, I just wanted to say that this was before I learned how to get more cinematic handheld shots, and I just kind of had the camera in random spots while we talked. So expect better in the future, but this is more of a listening episode anyway. And this was with me, Layla, Rose, and Rob. And unlike Jacob, we're not going to pretend we're an authority on the subject. Obviously, we have our convictions and we're going to say what we believe based on our understanding, but I'm not a historian. Even so, I'm confident that our discussion will be much more accurate and enlightening than his, and we're open to any and all additions and corrections if we got anything wrong. Let's get to it, homies. Yeah, I don't know why I'm Boba Fett either, man. Most of these avatars are they're pretty much all cringe, so deal with it, okay? At least I am not an anime girl or a banana. Could be worse. Rob, this is a serious topic, my guy.
SpongeRob.
SpongeBob.
Really not helping me get into the mood of this discussion of a horrible massacre.
Hey, are you watching this video without being subscribed?
So if you enjoy this channel, please subscribe. Not only will this ensure new episodes pop up in your feed, it also helps this content reach more people. So hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Imagine if there was a movie about the war in Gaza that portrayed the Jewish people generally as a pack of genocidal maniacs. Imagine there was a movie about 9/11 that portrayed the Muslim people generally as supporting the attacks of 9/11. Imagine if there was a movie about the Salem witch trials that gave the impression that Christians in general are a danger to women. Now imagine if there was a series on Netflix that took the 1857 Mountain Meadows Massacre and used it to imply that LDS pioneers were what this viewer now thinks.
Now imagine if Jacob Hansen was honest about the Mormon Reformation and the violent rhetoric, the blood atonement, the oath of vengeance that was in the temple endowment for 80 years, the extermination order for the Timpanogos Utes by Brigham Young, if he could be honest about that when he talks about Governor Boggs, but nope, this is what we get.
That Mormons were serial killers in the Wild West, like legitimately insane cult of just serial killers. I'm watching American Primeval on Netflix, and this seems pretty historically accurate. This show is insane.
And why wouldn't she think this? After all, People magazine says the following, quote, "The only thing more horrific than the violent story of American Primeval is that it's based on true events."
It is.
Now, most sane people think it's wrong to take the actions of a group of bad actors and generalize it to an entire population. But it seems like people lose their sanity when it comes to Latter-day Saints. In the new Netflix series American Primeval, the pioneer ancestors of the Latter-day Saints like myself are portrayed as bloodthirsty monsters based on an insanely inaccurate portrayal of what actually happened. Even the historical consultant for this movie said that this series is in no way based on actual history. You see, the best way to get people to believe a lie is to mix truth with the lie.
That was not accurate.
You see, it is true that a group of Mormons did massacre an entire wagon train of settlers heading to California in 1857. But was it the church that directed them to do this? Was what they did aligned with the church's teachings? Why did this happen? Well, here's what they don't tell you. The Latter-day Saints living in Utah in 1857 were there because they had been driven out by mobs in Missouri and Illinois. Latter-day Saint men, women, and children had been murdered and raped in places like Hans Mill. The governor of Missouri literally had a Mormon extermination order placed on their heads. And in 1857, the U.S. government was threatening to drive the Mormons from Utah as well. But you know what? I will let the acclaimed historian Leonard Arrington continue explaining what happened.
A company of Arkansas immigrants headed for California had been joined before they reached Utah by a group of horsemen called Missouri Wildcats.
Already he's wrong.
Boasted about participating in the Hans Mill Massacre and other...
Okay, I'm sorry. It's just so hard to see this guy who is representing the church going off an extremely... I mean, from the moment that the massacre happened, they didn't report it for weeks because they were trying to figure out what to do. Isaac Haight, the branch president that was pretty much responsible, like, for at least the orders that led to this, he had John D. Lee, Major John D. Lee, who he was above the Mormon militia, but the Nauvoo Legion, but the people he took was a ragtag group to carry out the massacre. He had him lie to Brigham Young, and we know this. They came up with these excuses about the wells being poisoned, people like that bragging, like the Missouri Wildcats don't even exist. Like, go look this stuff up. No, there's no records of anyone dying from poison in the wells. Like, this was a fabricated story, and we've known this for years and years and years. But all the way up till 2007, the church didn't fully acknowledge what happened. So it's just insane to me to see this guy, like, purposely using outdated sources that we know why they were told to Brigham Young. Brigham Young himself in his lifetime knew this wasn't true. Jacob Hamblin, our great whatever, mine and yours, great whatever grandfather, told yours too.
Yep, we're related from different wives.
Oh, that's crazy.
Yeah.
That is
Yeah. So this part actually made me kind of sad because, like, we grew up hearing all these stories about his integrity, his bravery in the face of death, his peacemaking with the Indians. But, like, when he learned about the details of what happened, and he told Brigham Young, the whole Paiute story isn't true. Like, this was all started by white men, by the Mormons. And Brigham Young told him to keep silent on it, like, don't speak about it. And, like, he knew. Brigham Young knew. So it is literally inexcusable for this guy to be using this outdated rhetoric. But because he has church sources quoting it, because the church always tries to use whatever sources sound good and not get the whole narrative, he thinks he can put in this video. It's insane.
And, like, scold everyone for, like, not being truthful about history when, like, they're just making a story that's obviously not totally accurate. But then he's straight up lying and mischaracterizing even what the creators of the show said about the show.
Right.
So
it's
like,
so ironic. I'm like, how are you going to get on YouTube, represent the church, and criticize the show for not being historical, and then use sources that the church knows this is an extremely outdated narrative that they used and they kept up and perpetuated for as long as they could to keep the government off of them. But everyone knows this isn't true. Who knows much of anything about the Mountain Meadows Massacre?
Mob actions against the Mormons. Some had expropriated supplies from Mormon farmers. But the gravest circumstance was the belief of Indians in central Utah that members of the train had poisoned their wells, and that some of their stock and some of their tribesmen had died. The Indians determined to attack them. By the time the company reached Mountain Meadows in southern Utah, the Indians laid siege. Meanwhile, they asked their Mormon friends to help them wreak their revenge. Warily, the Mormons, outnumbered now by the Indians in the region, declined. Pressed by the natives, local leaders on September 7th sent a courier to Brigham asking him what to do. Brigham's reply, written immediately, was as follows.
In regard to the emigration trains passing through our settlements, we must not interfere with them. The Indians we expect will do as they please, but you should try and preserve good feelings with them. While we should be on the alert, on hand, and always ready, we should also possess ourselves in patience.
Funny how the American Primeval show did not mention the fact that Brigham was desperate to ensure violence did not break out, and he sent a letter immediately telling the people there to leave the wagon train alone.
According to Haslam's later testimony, as he left Salt Lake, Brigham said to him, "Go with all speed, spare no horseflesh. The emigrants must not be meddled with. They must go free and unmolested." Haslam reached Cedar City about 11 a.m. on September 13th and delivered the message.
Okay, I just want to read some excerpts because this is crazy. It's just crazy, dude. First, I just want to read part of an article. I mean, who here's heard about the Oath of Vengeance? Yeah.
Heard of it, but I don't think I remember it.
Yeah. No, you're good. If you want to comment on it, Rob.
Basically, it's just like the church was really pissed off with the U.S. government for the fact that Joseph Smith was arrested after he ordered the burning down of the printing press and stuff, and he was taken to Carthage jail, and then he was killed. And they instituted an oath of vengeance against the United States that the church, it was like, I don't remember the wording, but basically that they would take him down eventually, and that they would destroy the United States government.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's how
like
a lot of them interpreted it, for sure, because they saw it as like persecution of the Gentiles, but to be like as accurate as possible so that they can't accuse us, of misrepresentation. It's definitely
this is me quoting from the top of my head.
Right. Which honestly,
seeing.
I think that's accurate to how a lot of people interpreted it. And it was basically a part of the temple endowment where they would make an oath to cry unto God to avenge the blood of the prophets. Like, it wasn't like it was anything super specific, but the fact that was part of their endowment every time, and a big part of something they were threatening or promising to keep secret and, covenanting to do at threat of their own lives.
You're taking an oath to do something here.
Yeah, of vengeance.
So it's like, yeah, exactly, to take vengeance against the United States government. And so crying unto God that he'll destroy them, like, it's not some weird interpretation to go, well, that means that, like, they all thought that eventually the church would destroy them. Because that's how it works, right? Is like, you ask God and God tells you what to do, and then you do it.
Yeah, and I want to set the stage a little bit more on this because it's really important, I think, because he doesn't address it at all. And we talked about this a little before the video, but the Mormon Reformation was a really interesting time that I think, because blood atonement you can actually trace back to Joseph Smith. Like, Brigham Young didn't only just say he got it from him, you can actually see why he says that in some quotes from him and in early church leaders. But everyone likes to say, oh, it's just a Brigham Young thing. No, it wasn't. That's just when it got big. Because during the Mormon Reformation, there's a... Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, he took it and ran with it. He was like, Joseph Smith taught this, so,
let's do it.
He, like, expounded on it and made it an actual, like teaching.
Yeah, it was kind of a fanatical time where everyone's expecting... I mean, it's called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They literally thought it was literally the last few days. Like, they're expecting the second coming at any moment, especially considering what Joseph Smith taught. And, of course, in retrospect, we say, oh, that wasn't really a second coming prophecy because it didn't happen. But, that's what people believed, that it would happen at any moment. And they're like, why isn't it happening? We must not be valiant enough, faithful enough. And Brigham Young, Jedediah Grant, his second counselor, started teaching some really crazy rhetoric, getting people rebaptized, teaching them that if you steal, you should die. You should literally atone. Like, apostates, the only way they can be saved is by atoning with their own blood. Miscegenation, like marrying a black person, he taught that you should literally be decapitated, and that's a law of God, and that it will always be so. And I want to read that. I know this is something that most of us have heard a lot as, post-Mormons, but I just want to set the stage because he's not, and really take the time to read a few of these quotes, because I think it's so important to understand people are living this and trying to think, why isn't the second coming happening? Why aren't I good enough? What more can I do? And just kind of this, like, rhetoric of fear and violence and the Old Testament fire and brimstone teaching. So I might not
had to tell Patriot. Sorry.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was thinking about the whole second coming, like the last days type thing. I just thought it was a random thought popped up. I thought it was funny they would literally have to start telling patriarchs, stop telling people that they will be alive.
Yeah, during the second coming, because like tens of thousands of people have been told that. Right.
And then I'll die.
Yeah.
Mine says that, by the way.
Crazy.
Mine too, I think.
Yeah.
Why did mine say that? Oh no, I'm gonna die first.
Well, it actually, I take that back. Mine said that I would tell my grandchildren what it was like before the millennium.
Oh, okay.
So it didn't
You could interpret that
explicitly
different
state
ways.
that I would live all the way through it.
Yeah, I
But,
think they've taken a
but it
step
said
back
that I
from
would
that.
tell my grandchildren about it.
Kind of like how they've taken a step back from the direct claims that apostles will lay hands on your head and you'll be healed. And then it's not working for not just the lower levels, priesthood holders, but also apostles. Like,
Yeah.
literally giving talks in conference about how important the faith to not be healed is, how it's even greater, because it just ain't working out the way the New Testament says it will. And it's so interesting because, like, this is a side tangent, but, like, if it actually worked at a clear degree, even just statistically better, way higher than normal, like, the whole world would be coming to Utah to figure out why people survive crazy conditions so much more. But that doesn't happen because it's not a thing.
Proof.
But at
Maybe
every
that's
level,
why God doesn't let it happen, because it wouldn't be a true test of your faith. You wouldn't have to learn and
exactly.
grow
And
organically.
and you know, that used to work for me, but now it's like that literally works for every single religion in the world. So if you have the true church, I'm gonna need it to be set apart. Like God, you know, God's gonna have to show it's not the same as every religion, and it's not gonna rely on the same cognitive blind spots. Anyways,
If you're gonna make these claims, back it up.
Yeah, there's got to be something different besides just we have good fruits, because hell, Jim Jones had good fruits and changed people's lives, and addicts were turned around, and you know how that ended.
Social Security checks. A trunk was filled with performed today on the body of the founder of the People's Temple, Jim Jones. His sons were simply going to sleep. Some had pillows beneath their heads. Some died alone, separated by families until the end. Babies were fed the lethal potion with it's believed each lived about 5 minutes after swallowing a mixture of cyanide and a flavor.
So, yeah, come on. Even the craziest cults have good fruits. But, you know, I'm sorry, I'm a little bitter here because this is such a rough topic, and I hate to see someone like misrepresent the history so much, but like I do think there's a lot of good in the LDS Church, and I do see it, like all religions, as a partial truth and a useful truth that helps people in some ways, but it's hard not to focus on the negative when you watch a video like this that disrespects the blood of the people who lived in this state before us and who had these lands and innocent people passing through. It's just so disrespectful. Where was I?
Disgraceful.
Yeah. Disgusting. All right, so I'm just gonna read a couple things about blood atonement and stuff, or yeah, just kind of the violent rhetoric that was going on. So with the Council of 50, we've got some of the minutes from that, and let me read this quote. Young spoke to the council about what to do with thieves, murderers, and adulterers, and said, "I want their cursed heads to be cut off that they may atone for their crimes." The council voted for the day that an imprisoned man had forfeited his head and to dispose of him privately. 2 weeks later, Young recommended decapitation for the man and a fellow prisoner, but the council decided to let them live. Later in 1851, the General Assembly of the state of Deseret, picked by the Council of 50, adopted a capital punishment provision allowing decapitation as a means of execution, which would remain in force until 1888. In a speech before the Utah Territory's legislature on February 5, 1852, Young appeared to advocate the passage of a law that required decapitation for whites who were condemned by the law for miscegenation with black people, which is literally, as you know, considering our mom freaked out about you two marrying just because you're white and she's not. I remember that was a big part of your transition, right?
Yeah, miscegenation, the law of miscegenation that races shouldn't mix. It's not unique to the LDS Church, but the thing is, the LDS Church makes a lot of really specific truth claims. And then they also, one of those truth claims is that they're a prophet and that they speak for God. And so when Brigham Young makes statements like that, where he says, "Shall I tell you the law of God concerning," he starts talking about this stuff and saying he's speaking for God. and like you said, that it will always be so. Yeah, literally says that
everlasting.
You should kill. Yeah.
Yeah.
That you should kill people if they have interracial relationships, and that's the only way to react to that situation.
And it's not like we got dirty looks from people when we would be like at a date at a restaurant here in Utah, especially in like areas that are a lot more kind of, I don't know, secluded, which like I grew up in a pretty secluded area of Utah, and I feel like when that happens, you get a lot more of like the, I don't know, old school believers that. Yes,
back when Mormon doctrine was seen as Mormon doctrine, and Spencer W. Kimball was still a prophet, you could read his books on your mission and everything.
Like people where I grew up remember when the bishop would be bringing beer to like the ward activities and things like that. And
hey, it's proved in the word of wisdom. I approve.
And so I don't know. It's just funny because like, it's not necessarily taught, but it's still a very prominent influence on, especially like, you know, older of Mormons, but it trickled down, you know? And like, anyway, yeah.
Oh, I wish your I wish your internet connection was working better because you keep cutting out. But I love that you're.
Sorry.
That's not your fault. I wish we could hear you better.
Did you get the gist of what she said, though? Because I could summarize it if you want.
I think so, but yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Just
because you can hear her in real life too, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and so she was saying, like, there's a lot of places, especially here in Utah, where there's, like, a lot of older members. And, like, even when things stop being officially taught by the church as doctrine, they're still practiced. And they still trickle down the generations because they're taught by their parents and so on, you know. Just like how you were saying, like, Mom tried to stop me from dating Rose because she was like, certain people just shouldn't mix. And I was like, Mom, that's racist. And she said, no, it's not racist. It's the teaching of the church. And here's why. But marriage is already hard. And when you take two cultures and two races and you try to mix, there's too many differences. And it makes it even harder. And I was like, Mom, that's racist. And it took like several people telling her that to her face for her to finally like start to register, like, oh, like the things I'm saying are straight up racist. The fact that I believe that people of two different races are so different that they just can't work out, even though like we obviously had this great relationship that she could see right in front of her. Thankfully, she's come a long way, and she's like really changed a lot of those beliefs. There have been other family members too that have like called her out straight up to her face and been like, "That's racist." And so, you know, she's come a long way. But yeah, there are a lot of places in Utah where teachings stick for a long time, even after the church stops officially teaching them as doctrine. It still is culturally and in practice. It's still taught, it's still practiced, it's still like the way things are. Even if the church can like separate itself from accountability a little bit, just like we were talking about how Brigham Young liked to do, where he's like doesn't necessarily want to be in the details, but he wants to like give the general instructions, and then he can sort of deny responsibility when things actually happen.
Right. Yesterday's doctrine becomes today's, oh, that's just church culture and we condemn that and that's cringe. Why would you say that about the church? It's like, are you kidding me?
Why are you so hung up on these things that are just culture and not even,
Yeah, you can see that with Elder Holland being like, where did this perfectionist mentality come from? And then you go back a little bit and you see prophets teaching about how perfection is attainable and criticizing you for even like saying a swear word or anything that, you know, you can be perfect in this, you can be perfect in tithing. Perfection is attainable in this life, and then wonder why moms are so stressed and kids are worried they're going to hell for masturbating. And he's like, oh, it's you guys, it's the members' fault. But in every instance that I can think of, you go back a few years and prophets were teaching it as coming from God. Like Brigham Young teaching that you should die, you should be decapitated. And we're going to read about Thomas Coleman. I know we've talked about him before, but that's a perfect example of how this rhetoric plays out in real time in the members in this violent early Utah Mormon Reformation period. So I'm going to read that real quick because it is so important, I think, for members to realize this is a real thing that really affected people's lives and really killed people. And it's not okay to pretend it didn't happen just because we don't do that anymore, because it's no longer a theocracy in Utah. Quite. So,
yeah, I mean, they still try. There's still a lot of problems with separation of church and state, but
yeah,
it's
a lot better. We're no longer so extreme.
Brigham Young's wet dream.
But yeah, that's another thing. Like when he's talking about this stuff, he was saying there's a time in the future, soon at hand, where he will enforce blood atonement. He's basically saying the only reason why he's not openly doing it now is because of the laws and because of the persecution that would come. But he's saying soon, we're going to be living a celestial law, and this will be enforced, and it will no longer be voluntary or done in the shadows by Danites or members that are just extremists, according to people now. But they are literally just following what he's teaching from the pulpit in the name of Christ. So shut the hell up, guys.
This elite little fighting force.
Yeah.
Can I say one more thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
Something that I found like kind of disturbing was when I started learning about this stuff for the first time. I was like in shock, and like once I did my research like thoroughly and I like confirmed sources and I was like, okay, like these things were unequivocally stated as doctrine. They were taught by the prophets. It's not some like, oh, well, they're not perfect people. It's like, no, this was taught as doctrine. So it's either true or it's not. Anyways, once I processed all of that, I started to kind of like, I talked about it with a couple of bishops and a couple of stake presidents. And what I found disturbing was that whenever I had those conversations, it always followed the pattern of like, first they denied it. And they just kind of like dismissed it and just told me to like go read my scriptures or like or do other things and like not look into that stuff. Then once I like showed them my research and the direct quotes and like they couldn't just dismiss it and say that that's not really what they said and that it's being misconstrued by anti-Mormons and stuff like that. Once they actually had to face it, like, no, those were the teachings, they just accepted it. And they were like, well, you know, once Christ comes, the whole earth, everybody who's not part of the elect is going to be burned and killed. And they're like, that's kind of a blood atonement. And during the millennium, if you're not living righteously, you're not going to be welcome there. And they were just kind of like, well, yeah. You know, once they got past denial and they had to face that, like, they actually said this stuff.
That a prophet like, really declared this.
Yeah, they were like, okay, well, that is kind of the law of God then. And so, yeah, eventually, once they say that it is time to do that, of course we're going to murder people for sinning. And it was just like, whoa, like, that opened my eyes to the insidious nature of the church and the way it, like, overrides your reasoning and your morals, because it just gives you this single source of truth philosophy that justifies you feeling so good about it no matter what. Like, you know, if you basically feel like you're Nephi cutting off Laban's head and you're like, this is good, even though it feels bad, this is good and I'm righteous for doing it. Anyways, that's all. I just found it really disturbing, like the times that I had those conversations with church leaders, like once they had to face that it was real, the way that they could just override their own logic and their own morals, that a few minutes ago they felt like that was all wrong, you know? And it's like Al-Qaeda or something. It's like this little sleeper organization that could go really bad at any time. And who knows when that time, like as soon as the prophet decides to ask people to do something terrible, like they'll just do it.
Yeah, and I don't think that he will anymore. But the truth is, it's true that if he did, a lot of people would, not everyone. But I mean, that's why books like When Prophecy Fails are so important. Like, see it in other organizations first, because it'll be easier than see it in your own. Even when there's a direct disconfirmation of your faith or a clash, like if you've invested enough time, money, and identity into an ideology, even a direct disconfirmation isn't enough. You will find a way to re-justify it, just like everyone else, just like the Jehovah's Witnesses, when the prophesied time, the second coming didn't come over and over and over, then like, oh, well, he came in spirit. Flat earthers, even recently with the 48-hour sun, just like constantly for months. But like in Antarctica, they fly people out there, they stream it from multiple different camera angles live, showing other camera angles, and they're still like, oh, green screen or whatever. You know, like it doesn't matter what and how much you do to disprove. Like there comes a point where some people just cannot come to any other conclusion, and it becomes a reality that their morality and their decision making is outsourced to that thing that they've always believed they can justify outsourcing it to, and that is above their own, and that is scary.
Yep.
And that is a big reason
like blind sheep.
the Mountain Meadows Massacre.
Even you know, right?
They're
and
following
it's like
their
easy
local
to think,
authorities.
Well, they wouldn't do that stuff today. Other people are bad and to be destroyed. And it's just like built into the way they think. It's built into the way that they believe that the church history and the church future is supposed to be written.
Well, Layla's dad, I talked to him the other day because he knew, what's his name? Ron Lafferty? There's so many things that I just lose track. I think it's Ron Lafferty, but like...
Oh, shit.
Yeah, he knew him. He tried to get him to join the School of the Prophets, and he dealt personally with someone who ended up joining him and told him at his house and basically tried to keep him from leaving if he was going to tell anyone about it. But like this stuff happens a lot, and like we talked about multiple people in our home ward that got radicalized into polygamy of certain family where her husband wanted to kill her, which is so crazy. We just found out about this on Facebook, but like this normal seeming Mormon family, he was indoctrinated into polygamy because if you actually read those prophets saying like the moment we preach against polygamy, you'll know we're in apostasy and things like that. Obviously, some members who truly are following to the utmost, like I was taught to, and that they're literally the mouthpieces of God, that's a conclusion they're going to come to. Anyways, sorry to also...
How you doing, Layla?
Yeah, Layla, are you still with us?
Yeah.
Is there, sorry to talk so much about history and stuff. I know it's not really your thing. Is there something you want to talk about more?
No, I'm just listening.
Are you sure?
Isn't that also this time period when Brigham Young disbanded Relief Society 20 years?
Sorry, I heard when Brigham Young disbanded
the Relief
Society.
This is the same time period when Brigham Young disbanded the Relief Society for like 20 years.
I'm actually not sure exactly when that happened, so I can't say. I know that happened, but I'm not sure. Good question. We'll have to look that up. So I was talking about blood atonement. Yeah, so let me just read this part going on with miscegenation and your guys' experience and how these doctrines trickle down even to like almost 200 years later, 150 years later. He told the legislature that miscegenation was a grave sin that would bring a curse upon a man and all of his children that were produced as a result of the union. He said that if a white Mormon in an unguarded moment should commit such a transgression, decapitation would be a great deal towards atoning for the sin. It would do them good that they might be saved with their brethren. He said, it's the greatest blessing that could come to some men to shed their blood on the ground and let it come up before the Lord as an atonement. Earlier, when Brigham Young heard that a black Mormon in Massachusetts had married a white woman, he told the quorum of the 12 apostles that he would have them killed if they were far away from the Gentiles. On December 11th, this is back to Thomas Coleman, the black Mormon who was courting a white woman in Utah. So this is, Brigham Young just said he would have him killed if he was closer. And now we see what happens when someone is closer. We just don't have direct evidence it was Brigham Young himself, but who cares? Like, this is what he's teaching. Open. Like, this, you can't deny this is what he's teaching. So on December 11th, Coleman was discovered by friends of the woman. The group of vigilantes hit Coleman with a large rock. Using his own Bowie knife, his attackers slit his throat so deeply from ear to ear that he was nearly decapitated, as well as slicing open his right breast in what some believe was a mimicry of the penalties which are illustrated in the temple ritual. Not all of Coleman's wounds correlated with the temple ritual, however, since he was also castrated. A pre-penciled placard which read, "Notice to all N-words. Take warning. Leave white women alone," was then pinned to his corpse. Yeah. And as you know... Go ahead.
Oh, just that was like the second story that I heard that solidified me leaving church.
Nice. Love to see it. We love to see people not try and justify their shit. And most people have heard this quote. I mean, there's so many. There's honestly way worse than this one, but it's directly related, so I'll just read this. Shall I tell you the law of God in regard to the African race? If the white man who belongs to the chosen seed mixes his blood with the seed of Cain, the penalty under the law of God is death on the spot. This will always be so.
This will always be so.
It's like, why can a prophet of God, if he is that, declare these things as a law of God and not make you question what everything they teach us about the mantle of the prophet means? Everything, the Bible, anything, Doctrine and Covenants. Like we've talked about Deuteronomy 18, it says like, if a prophet shall speak a word in my name which I've not told him to speak, even that prophet shall die. Like, why is it that anytime there's a contradiction, we just ignore it? Like, this is crazy, dude.
Very frustrating.
Like, oh my god. It's the outright things people will murder, justify murder.
One of the bishops that I was talking to about this stuff actually used that quote. And he said, hey, you know what? Like, you and I don't understand it. But I know for a fact that they were teaching the Word of God because he said, you know how I know that he was a prophet of God? Is because after he said that, he was not killed. And that means he must be a prophet of God. And I said, what about Muhammad or any of the other thousands of people that you would call a false prophet? Like, God didn't strike them down for saying things that you don't think are true. So, like,
and they
how
use
does that
the
make
same
any sense?
apologetics for them too.
Yeah.
Wow. What a time. What a time. That people in 2025 are defending this nonsense. It's crazy.
I know.
I also wanted to say something that they mention. Actually, you know, we probably read enough on this for now. Let's just say, yeah, if you don't believe that blood atonement was a thing, you're not looking very hard.
You are not paying attention.
Yeah.
Days too late. Owing to provocations from the immigrants, the local settlers' fear of infuriating the Indians, and their own hysteria, members of the local militia joined the Indians in killing some 120 immigrants, including all the women. Only 18 small children were saved.
Look, this is one of the most disgusting tragedies in American history, and it was indeed perpetrated by people who called themselves Mormons. But of course, American Primeval misrepresents Brigham Young and does not mention his reaction when he heard about what had happened.
When the local Mormon farmer John D. Lee brought word of the massacre to Brigham, he stated only that the Indians had done it. The details were so gruesome that Brigham Young wept.
You see, local Mormons, after committing the massacre, saw Brigham's letter, and then they decided to do everything they could to cover up what had actually happened. Some later claimed that Brigham ordered the massacre, but there is zero evidence of this. The renowned biographer of Brigham Young, John Turner, summarized...
I hate how he doesn't mention there is zero evidence of the claims in the video he just played to represent this, and that all the evidence shows that this was made up and given to Brigham Young to protect Isaac Haight and the local leaders that ordered this on a local level, but also, again, based on the rhetoric that Brigham Young was teaching. Like, it's insane. Like, how can he not know about this?
His definition for evidence keeps changing because he says, these people said that this happened. And then he says, these people said that this happened, but there's
no
zero
evidence.
But the only evidence he gave for the other thing was that they said that.
The thing is, there's more evidence for Brigham Young. Like, there's him making threats to people, being like, I have people everywhere telling me everything. Like, you can't hide from me. Like, I've got spies everywhere, basically. And then at the same time, he had no idea, even though, again, like, our own ancestor told him exactly what happened, and Brigham Young told him not to speak of it and to continue with the cover-up. Like, this is crazy.
This is the historical consensus.
There is no satisfactory evidence that Young ordered the massacre. The most straightforward reading of Young's letter is exculpatory.
So in this series, they don't mention the context. They don't mention Brigham explicitly telling them to leave the wagon train alone. They don't mention Brigham Young weeping over the loss of innocent life. They don't mention that Brigham Young was told it was only Indians who participated. And they don't mention that once Brigham knew the full story, he took action, with the leader of the group being excommunicated from the church and then executed by firing squad.
Okay, that's not true. That only happened after they failed to cover it up long term. And like we mentioned, let me go back a tiny bit. And yeah, there was more evidence, like Will Bagley and some other historians. There's a reason why. Like, I'm not going to say, of course, there's no definitive evidence that he ordered it. I don't think he did. But there is good enough reason to suspect that he could have, because he did do a lot of things publicly different from behind the scenes, things that he knew could make it back to the government and what he said in private. So, like, to say there's no, exactly, there's more evidence on that than the conclusions he's trying to draw. But I'll give him that. Like, there isn't, but, like, there's more evidence for it than you're willing to admit. And you don't bring up any examples of why some people have speculated that he actually might have known, despite publicly being misled and trying to stick with that narrative as long as possible.
Yeah, and like the fact that like one person was held responsible so long after it happened, after they failed to cover it up. You know, it's like, okay, that one person was responsible. Really? Like, it just seems like such an easy cop-out for them to just like choose a scapegoat, you know?
And what's weird is later on, he gets all his temple blessings reinstated, his wives resealed to him, whereas if he was actually guilty of murder, if they saw him as guilty of murder, Doctrine and Covenants says he'll have no forgiveness in this life or in the life to come. So, like, there's so many loose ends that don't make sense if you actually believe LDS doctrine and you actually read all the details.
Leader of the group being excommunicated from the church and then executed by firing squad. They also don't mention that in 1999, President Gordon B. Hinckley and the leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints brought together the descendants of the victims to dedicate a monument to their...
Oh my God, I'm sorry I have to stop this, like, so much, but he is getting so much wrong. President Hinckley didn't bring this together. They actually were petitioning the church, President Hinckley, to make a memoriam, because it was torn down several times. That's actually where the quote, "vengeance is mine," comes from in the new book, is from Brigham Young, where he says that about what happened, supposedly because he still believed that it was, you know, anti-Mormons and stuff, and that they were killed by the Indians. But, like, the monument made for the graves of these people was desecrated multiple times by Mormons. And then President Hinckley, they actually petitioned him, and then the church ended up being like, oh, this is a good PR move, and they took credit for it. This is on record. Most people, not everyone knows this, but you know, clearly Jacob Hansen wouldn't know that, or he's being intentionally deceitful, but either way, he's wrong.
President Henry B. Eyring said, "What was done here long ago by members of our church represents a terrible and inexcusable departure from Christian teaching and conduct. We cannot change what happened, but we can remember and honor those who were killed here. We express profound regret for the massacre carried out in this valley 150 years ago, and for the undue and untold suffering experienced by the victims." Look, in every religion, there are people who go against the teachings of that religion and do terrible things. You see, the question you need to ask is, do they do these things because of that religion, or do they do it in spite of it? The real irony here is that one of the biggest reasons the Mountain Meadows Massacre happened was because of misinformation and hysteria. The reality is that hysteria and misinformation, like that found in this series, can have very real and terrible consequences.
Yeah, so true. Let's go back to what Brigham Young was teaching. Like, what he's saying is so ironic that he's not recognizing where that hysteria came from. That it was in their temple, that it was from the pulpit, that it was from the pulpit, not only from the prophet, but in their local church meetings. It's crazy. I actually want to stop this for a sec because there's quite a... First of all, I want to read a bit of an excerpt of what actually happened. This is much more up to date of what we know about what happened, and way more accurate and way more disturbing. The immigrants, now known to history as the Fancher Party, Baker Fancher, were camped at Mountain Meadows, an alpine oasis on the wagon road between Salt Lake City and Los Angeles. The party, led by veteran plainsmen familiar with the California Trail and its variants, consisted of a dozen large, prosperous families and their hired hands. The wagon train comprised 18 to 30 wagons pulled by ox and mule teams, plus several hundred cattle and a number of blooded horses the men were driving to California's Central Valley. The company included about 140 men, women, and children. The women and children outnumbered the able-bodied men 2 to 1. As daylight broke in the remote Utah Territory Valley, a volley of gunfire and shower of arrows ripped into the wagon camp from nearby ravines and hilltops, immediately killing or wounding about a quarter of the adult males. The surviving men of the Fancher Party leveled their lethal long rifles at their hidden painted attackers and stopped the brief frontal assault in its tracks. The Arkansans pulled their scattered wagons into a circle and quickly improved their wagon fort, digging a pit to protect the women and children from stray projectiles. Cut off from any source of water and under continual gunfire, the immigrants fended off their assailants for 5 long, hellish days. On Friday, September 11th, hope appeared in the form of a white flag. The immigrants let the emissary, a Mormon from a nearby settlement, into their fort. And then John D. Lee, the local Indian agent, followed. Lee told the Arkansans he and his men had come to rescue them from the Indians. If the immigrants would lay down their arms, the local militia would escort them to safety. And by the way, it wasn't just their arms, they had them lay down their possessions, and they had over $100,000 in gold alone, which was really, this is another part they don't talk about, like how much the Mormons were struggling at the time and needed wealth. And like this was the wealthiest party to come through there. So 100,000 in gold, tons of they had so much cattle and horses. And anyways, I'm gonna be careful because that's how much I know, but I know there's a lot more too. Jewelry and stuff, they took off the women. So they had them leave their weapons and all their things behind under the guise of safety, of escorting them safely away from the Indians under a white flag. And then let's continue. The travelers had few options. They surrendered and agreed to Lee's strange terms. Though Mormons separated the survivors into 3 groups, the wounded and youngest children led the way in 2 wagons. The women and older children walked behind, and the men, each escorted by an armed guard, brought up the rear. Lee led this forlorn parade more than a mile to the California Trail and the rim of the Great Basin. There, the senior Mormon officer escorting the men gave an order, perhaps halt, but by most accounts, do your duty. A single shot rang out, and each escort turned and shot his man. So, do your duty, which most accounts say. All the armed men, because they were lined up escorting, they would turn and shoot them in the head under the guise of safety and protecting them. Painted savages, a few of whom may have been actual Indians, because, again, they enlisted the help of a few Paiutes in exchange for cattle, but mostly it was Mormons painted to look like Indians and trying to make sure that if there were any... Because originally, I don't think they were planning on wiping out everyone. It was actually they were trying to... It was a cattle raid. And when things started to go south and they knew that they would be seen and recognized as not just Indians, they're like, oh, well, let's kill them all. A few painted savages, a few of whom may have been actual Indians, jumped out of the oak brush lining the trail and cut down the women and children, while Lee directed the murder of the wounded. Within 5 minutes, the atrocity was over. Everyone was dead except for 17 orphans, all under the age of 7, whom the killers deemed too young to be credible witnesses and who qualified as innocent blood under Mormon doctrine. For the men who committed this horrific atrocity, the legacy of Mountain Meadows became a haunting memory they could never escape. Those most guilty of the crime explained it with denials, lies, and alibis that twisted and turned as the evidence inevitably came out. Some of the killers went mad. Some apparently killed themselves, and several fled to Mexico. but only one man faced the music, and was executed for the crime. John D. Lee, regarded as a scapegoat. I haven't really heard that. Regarded as a scapegoat by his descendants and historians alike. For the children who survived and the families of the victims, the massacre became a deep and enduring wound. The murderers appropriated the Fancher train's considerable property and cash. Much of it apparently made its way into Mormon leader Brigham Young's pockets, and not a penny of compensation was ever offered to the survivors, which were only children, unlike in the show. For many living descendants and relatives of the victims who have long been slandered as frontier hard cases who got what they deserved, the massacre remains a bitter injustice. For today's Latter-day Saints, Mountain Meadows is the most troubling event in their religion's complicated history. There is nothing like it in the face history of suffering, sacrifice, and devotion. For 150 years, leaders and official historians of the LDS Church have worked hard to justify or explain away the crime, and a large part of the legacy of the murders is a tangled web of lies and deception.
I just think it's funny how, like, in his video that's supposed to be setting the record straight, he's like so inaccurate and misrepresents literally everything he talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, like, what he's criticizing was not meant to be historically accurate. It was meant to be a story based on those events.
Exactly.
You know, like,
yeah,
he's the one being dishonest here.
Yeah,
anyways, that was all. Just a little.
Right.
Little
I mean, I do somewhat sympathize with him because, sure, like a lot of people don't pay attention to that and they're not going to look into it and just be like, whoa, Mormons were crazy. And they did go a little overboard in that, but also look what she says about the Mountain Meadows Massacre, which is what he's talking about specifically. This is what historians say.
I know Darren will agree with this, that the actual violence, the actual history was far worse than what's depicted. So there's a lot of fictional depictions of violence. In the series, the actual violence was far worse. So.
And that's hard to imagine because it has shooting in the face, it has arrows through the head, it has scalping, like, yeah.
Yeah, the mountain. Well,
yeah.
I want Darren to jump in too, but both massacres, most of the victims were children.
Oh.
At least 5 adults had gunshot exit wounds in the posterior area of the cranium, a clear indication some were shot while facing their killers. Women were also shot in the head at close range. At least one youngster, believed to be about 10 or 12 years old, was killed by a gunshot to the top of the head. Virtually all of the postcranial, from the head down, bones displayed extensive carnivore damage, confirming written accounts that bodies were left on the killing field to be gnawed by wolves and coyotes. Salt Lake Tribune, March 13th, 2000, page 8 through 5. And then one final quote. The massacre has left the Mormon Church on the horns of a dilemma, says Utah historian Will Bagley, author of the forthcoming book on Mountain Meadows, who I quoted in the articles prior. It can't acknowledge its historic involvement in the mass murder. And if it can accept its accountability, it can't repent.
So this part I wanted to share based on what he said about President Hinckley's involvement and the quote-unquote apology. Because it wasn't until 2007 that the church even actually fully owned up to the narrative, like what actually happened, like all the details. Because they were trying for so long to kind of stick to the accounts that were given to Brigham Young, knowing that they weren't true, but not wanting to be fully open about the history and everything that they knew. I think it's largely due to Juanita Brooks that we even are where we are with this, because she was an incredible author. If you don't know her story, as a mom typing on her typewriter behind the scenes, trying to not piss off the church and working through just her. She was able to work through diaries. She didn't even have access to everything that Barbara Brown, the historian we looked at a moment ago, had in her new book, Vengeance is Mine, with Richard Turley. But like a lot of this stuff was hidden or obscured or taboo for so long that it wasn't until 2007 we started to hear from the church itself any admittance to what really happened. And even then, I mean, even with President Hinckley, though, let's see what he said.
Both sides were disappointed by Mr. Hinckley's remarks. He continued to hedge on the issue of church responsibility.
By the way, this is in the ceremony that he put in his video, where he's like, "Oh, look at President Hinckley making restitution."
Even adding a legal disclaimer many found offensive. That which we have done here must never be construed as an acknowledgement of the part of the church of any complicity in the occurrences of that fateful day, he said. This was thought by many to be an effort to avoid wrongful death lawsuits, but the church's reluctance to apologize is more complicated. At a time when religions around the world are acknowledging and atoning for past sins, the massacre has left the Mormon Church in a quandary. Roman Catholics have apologized for their silence during the Holocaust, United Methodists for their massacre of American Indians during the Civil War, Southern Baptists for their support of slavery, and Lutherans for Martin Luther's anti-Jewish remarks. But unlike leaders of other religions who are believed to be guided by the hand of God, Mormon prophets are considered extensions of Him. To acknowledge complicity on the part of the church leaders runs the risk of calling into question Brigham Young's divinity and the Mormon belief that they are God's chosen people. If good Mormons committed the massacre, wrote a Mormon writer, Levi Peterson, if prayerful leaders ordered it, if apostles and a prophet knew about it and later sacrificed John D. Lee, then the sainthood of even the modern church seems tainted.
A lot of people don't know Brigham Young basically did his own extermination order of the Timpanogos Utes. It's the Provo River Massacre, which is crazy because, BYU's right nearby, and now they have a statue of him and a university after him, and no one seems to know, not many people anyway in the church, that he did an extermination of his own that wiped out a lot of innocent Utes, Timpanogos tribe there. And it started from literally an Indian, one man stealing an article of clothing from a Mormon, and then three friends killed that man, and then the Indians in retaliation stole some cattle, and then they're like, all right, they need to go.
Wipe them out.
Yeah, it's so dumb. It's like
So
the Indians still hadn't murdered anyone in this case. And again, yeah, some tribes, I'm not going to be like, okay, it's all just like Pocahontas, animated. They definitely didn't do any shitty things themselves. Of course they did. But that doesn't mean we should not own up to what we did wrong. And in this case, this was absolutely horrible.
Yeah,
and if he's going to talk about the...
for it, then... I'm sorry. I was going to say it's a genocide.
Yeah, it was.
It's the definition for genocide. It's an ethnic cleansing, and people just don't care. They're just like, well, it's our leader, it's our faith, so we're just gonna not think about that.
Yeah, and if you're gonna mention General Boggs, like his extermination order wasn't just like, oh, kill all Mormons. It was to drive them from the state. It was to get them to move, and then if necessary, kill them. And that's, let's see what Brigham Young did, because why doesn't he mention this? Is it not the same? Let's see.
Credit for. Having said that, he ordered I don't want to say an execution of the Utes in 1850 out of Utah County.
Yes.
So there was a large population of the Timpanogos Utes that lived there, and the Saints were establishing communities further south. They needed to pass through that area. And so Utah County was a critical area. Resource-wise, too, because of the fish. The Utes didn't want to give it up, the Timpanogos people. And the leadership that was in Utah County at the time went to Brigham Young and said, we've got to get rid of them. We have got to get rid of them. It's the only way we're going to secure passage to the south. And Brigham Young kind of fought him on it a little bit, and in the primary sources I've read, and said, we don't want to kill him. And finally, they talked him into, and he signed this order that said, do everything you can to get them to leave. But if they don't leave, then that extermination order is in effect. You can kill them if they won't leave. And so Brigham Young signing that extermination order of any Utes that will not leave willingly in 1850 kind of gives you a playbook of what he's capable of anyway. But he kind of fought it at first and said, we don't want to kill them. We've got to befriend them and do everything we can to get along. But I think he was coerced into it by the other leadership that actually lived there. But still, at the end of the day, he was the prophet. He signed off on it. And that's what they did for the next few years.
We have greater power and we're in the right and we have our motives and reasons and justifications. And this people, they need to move or die. It's the same exact thing.
One of the most frustrating things that I realized is just that I felt like Mormon truth was like the ultimate source of truth, and then to realize how fucking subjective their truth is constantly was the most disappointing thing I feel like that I realized.
Yeah.
How subjective?
Could you guys tell what she said?
It was cutting out a bit.
Yeah. Well, she was saying that like to grow up like thinking that the church is the one true church, and like to be taught that like the core value, one of the core values of the church is truth. To realize how like falsified the history is and how subjective their version of truth is was really disappointing for her.
Right. Because when you're like, oh, well, we know we're right, so anything negative, it's just going to mar people's, chances of coming to the truth, you can justify it. And that's why every religion that thinks they're the one chosen group does this. And why sexual abuse gets covered up so much by Curtin McConkie is because each person doing that doesn't even realize how pervasive it is, because that doesn't even occur to them. It's like, oh, well, this one small thing, I got to make this sacrifice of covering it up so that it doesn't keep all these people from the truth. Yeah, for the greater good. And that's how these religions that seem so good on the outside and might have good fruits can also have so many negative fruits that most of the members never are even conscious of. And Mount Meadows is just one of many examples of how that happens with the way they hide and obscure their history and justify it. And I think it is a disgrace to the lives of those people, the innocent blood that was shed. And I think that Jacob Hansen's video is another disgrace in that line, and that it deserves to be called out. It's like, I have ancestors that were involved in this that I looked up to and respected, but like, I've got to recognize where things went wrong, and this was wrong, and there's no way around that. And you shouldn't try and sugarcoat it and misdirect. And you shouldn't use false narratives that everyone, even the church, knows and admits are false. Like, I just have a hard time believing that wasn't intentional. But at the same time, if it was unintentional, it just goes to show how apologists tend to look at issues on a surface level of just finding an answer that sounds good, and that'll keep people from digging deeper.
Bias. Yeah, I found it funny that Jacob Hansen wouldn't even call them Mormons. He was like, it's true that this
called themselves Mormons
was perpetrated by people who called themselves Mormons.
Right.
And it's like, dude, like, why are you being so deceptive and misleading in every sentence that you're saying in this video? Like, is that not a red flag for you?
The no true Scotsman fallacy. Yeah, it's like, okay, yeah, these people were definitely members of the church, following their local leaders, following the rhetoric from their prophet in the name of God, and you're going to pretend that they're not members because you don't like what they did now. Mm-hmm. Because the church didn't get the power it wanted to create a theocracy where he could enforce that. And the second coming didn't happen when they thought it would, where he could enforce blood atonement legally.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know much about the Mountain Meadows Massacre, so it was kind of a rough watch. Very gruesome.
Yeah.
Heartbreaking.
Yeah, but it was good. Brought up a lot of questions too. Wasn't sure how accurate it was. I don't know much about.
Right.
Stuff.
It's dramatized. It's historical fiction. So you're like, how much of this should I care about?
Yeah. Like, because growing up in the church, they always talked about how persecuted the Mormons were. And then watching this, I was like, well, was that warranted then? Like, You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, that'll.
There's two
come
sides
up with
to
that.
all stories.
Yeah.
I mean, I will say there was real persecution, but most Mormons, almost none of them that I've ever met, seem to know anything about, when it comes to the Mormon-Missouri War, the things we did do on our side. The LDS Church burning down the Gentiles' homes and stealing things because they believe, again, it's Gentiles, like it's justified, and they're persecuting us. Like it wasn't like the Hansmill massacre happened out of nowhere. I'm not going to say it was right. Like there was really messed up stuff going on both sides, but the way that they were voting and the way they would take, like initially people were super welcoming of the Mormons. It wasn't until they earned a bad reputation that people started wanting them out. But that's all we ever hear about. We don't hear about the salt sermon from Sidney Rigdon talking about, taking, basically destroying the people that they see as enemies of the church. Mm-hmm. So yeah, there was definitely a lot going on both sides. There was persecution, but we did our own fair share of fighting the infidels.
Yeah, and watching it too, it also kind of hit close to home a little bit because I have my great grandfather or whatever, like I've heard stories of him and like fighting with the Indians and stuff like that. And then watching the show, I was like, wait, so we were the bad guys? You know what I mean? Like, I don't know, just hearing a different side of the story, I was like, oh, shoot.
Yeah, when you're a kid and you just hear like these cowboy and Indian type stories where like our brave ancestors, pioneer ancestors came across the plains and like established Zion and had to like defend Zion, and you admire these people,
Yeah.
But yeah, same type of deal. I definitely had that moment like a few times where I'm like, oh, we were the bad guys.
Yeah.
Shit,
we were the Empire.
This isn't what I learned. Have you heard of Jacob Hansen, or are you guys all safe from the mess of online Mormon
I've heard of
apologetics
him. I haven't really watched any of his stuff.
Ex-Mormons? Yeah.
I know
Good for
he's
you.
like... Yeah, I don't really know. But yeah, I know he's an apologetic.
He's a dude.
I'm not interested in Mormon apologetics whatsoever. But I'm curious to hear what he says, obviously. I would like that. I usually steer away from
what the heck, bros? Don't you know you can leave the church, but you can't leave it alone? You're supposed to be like me and keep engaging with the nonsense. Not just live your life happy outside the church. I freaking love this map. It's so peaceful.
Agreed.
I
really
fell
pretty.
down through the hole and I tried to use the grapple hooks and I was like, oh, this is not that world.
Oh, you guys do the grapple world a lot?
Yeah, we both set it as our home world.
Nice.
I think it is interesting to talk about like what is historically accurate and what isn't historically accurate about this, but for the most part, I feel like it's almost a pointless question because of course not every character in this is real. Like of course this is just a story that's like set in that time, that's set in like that setting, and so like to me what matters that it's realistic is like, is the setting more or less realistic? Like is that sort of the type of challenges that these people were dealing with at the time? Are those the sort of powers that were at play? And so on, and so like of course the characters in it aren't real and their storyline through it is made up. It's like if you were to create a show about what it would have been like to live in ancient Egypt, and then people are like, that's not true because there was never a guy named whatever who lived in wherever, and it's like, duh, that's not the point. You're completely missing the point. Like they're just creating a story about what it would have been like to be there among those times and among those people.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that, but there's one thing I will agree with Jacob Hansen on, and that is that it was a little unfair how far they went in portraying, like, first of all, the massacre, the Bear River Massacre, that was carried out by not the Mormon militia, but by the U.S. government, by the federal government militia, and we never killed, Brigham Young was terrified of the government. He didn't want to attack them directly. He made like behind the scenes threats. He tried to organize Indians to like go on cattle raids so that he could be like, oh, I've been holding back the Indians, but now I won't, stuff like that. Act like they needed him. Brigham Young sent out soldiers to burn down fields before the troops could get there so that their their horses couldn't have grass to eat, and delayed them so that they'd be stuck in the winter and not be able to pass over. Like, he did a lot of stuff, but he never attacked them. He was terrified of them. He also didn't ride around Fort Bridge or anything. He was hiding and sending out letters, and he was hiding behind like 10-foot walls in a fort because he didn't want to end up the way Joseph Smith did. He wasn't, he wasn't the way they depicted him at all. He's very careful, very sly. But I do think it was unfair to show these Mormons just doing these atrocities that they didn't commit, and then not even, but at the same time, the actual Meadows Massacre was worse than what was depicted and carried out very differently. So I guess you win some, you lose some.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it was like Rose said, kind of just refreshing to see the like attitude of the church portrayed differently, and like just sort of the setting and the thought process behind things seemed more realistic, more accurate. Because all we grow up seeing is like these idealistic, like warm, fuzzy, like just silly depictions of these people as these like amazing people who are being persecuted for no reason, and they're just like Gandhi type figures that are like, I don't know why they're doing this to me,
It's the only explanation is Satan.
Like sickeningly it's just like sickeningly inaccurate. So like I get the criticisms of things like this where like of course not all the details are accurate, but at the same time it's like it's a story that's meant to be set in those times. That's like what it would be like for people who would be just kind of caught between these different forces and these conflicting goals and motives between the powers that did exist there on the plains in like a pretty lawless time. And Brigham Young definitely like you said, he exercised his power through others, and like a lot of times he didn't really want to know all the details. He didn't want to be culpable, which is why there were organizations like the Danites and like the like blood atonement and stuff. Like he would give general instructions without saying like specifically this guy needs to die,
You're right. When it came to how blood atonement carried out, it was usually careful. If he we do have some examples of it. One that's very well documented where someone voluntarily had their throat slit.
Yeah.
Because they were he initially went to Brigham Young.
Like daughter?
Yeah, it was his stepdaughter who was an adult.
Was his, like,
from what I hear. I mean, that's the thing is like at this time, he thought that when he told Brigham Young, he'd be like, "Oh, okay. Whoa, what happened to your eyes? They're not showing up for me anymore. What the heck?
Whoa, same.
Oh, they just came back.
Oh, they were closed, I guess.
Yeah, I've never seen that. Something you're pushing like must make your eyelashes disappear.
I was muting it so it wouldn't echo for you.
Oh, that's what it does.
I mute it?
Yep, when you mute it, your eyelashes disappear. It's like it. But yeah, originally when this guy went to Brigham Young, I mean, considering that Joseph Smith was married to mother-daughter pairs, he was married to both the mom and her daughter. Maybe he thought, oh, this wouldn't be that weird because it was really fucked up. Like Brigham Young himself was 54, married a 15-year-old, I think, or 16-year-old, 15 or 16, Clarissa something, and they had like 5-6 children. So like it was a really messed up time, and he probably thought, oh, well, I gotta follow the example of the prophets and admit that I did this. But Brigham Young said, no, if that happens again, because I from what I know, she was an adult, so maybe it's slightly less fucked up than some other stuff that was already happening. But either way, it was it was messed up. But he's like, if that happens again,
and it was consensual. It was
right. It was consensual.
They were trying to keep themselves away from each other. Is basically what was going on.
It's still weird.
They quote unquote fell again.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they were like, well, like you already repented of it, and so now you're doing it again. Like you can't just be forgiven just like that because you're just doing it again.
Right.
And so
Now
the
you
only
need
way
your own blood
to be
atone.
forgiven. Yeah.
So weird.
Yeah, I mean that's. Yeah, yeah, exactly. And Brigham Young wasn't. I don't think he actually was involved in the council that made that decision. If he was, it wasn't documented. That's the thing and that's kind of what I mean is that he sort of acts through people. He doesn't want to be directly culpable. For a lot of these kinds of things, like he gives general instructions and like policy.
I have some
but
things
I don't
from
think
the Council of 50 where he is directly. I think what you're saying is more when it's behind closed doors, when it's like not in public, because we have the Council of 50 notes where he is advocating for thieves and adulterers and fornicators.
Right. Well, that's what I'm saying is like he's saying
consensually before marriage. Guess what? Have your head decapitated. Like that's what he's trying to advocate.
Yeah, that's exactly what
for
I'm
a
talking
law
about.
for that. Yeah.
So he's talking about, hey, here's what you need to do in these kinds of circumstances, and if people do this, this, and this, then like, fuck them, basically.
Yeah.
But then when it comes to individuals, he's not like sitting on the council that's like determining the punishment for that individual person. So that kind of seemed pretty accurate to me in the show, in the sense that they represented that style of him being like, take care of it. I don't want to know, but yes, kill them, but don't tell me, like, I don't want to hear you talk about it again. Like, go take care of it. Go like wipe them out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is something, actually I'll save it. I'll save it for the video. I'm not sure if I should like say it now or during the video with certain things, but I think we should just start the video because we got some good thoughts going on here.